Hi everyone, today I'm going to be filming my January wrap-up. This is actually the first time in a while that I've done a monthly wrap-up because I kind of just did one for the last 3 months of the year, but I'm sort of back to my regular reading schedule this month, and I have, how many books? I read 12 books in total this past month, so that's enough to do a monthly wrap-up video. We'll start off with some statistics. Like I mentioned, read 12 books. Out of those books, 9 of them were fantasy. 1 was science fiction, 1 was a mystery, and 1 was a classic. And then in terms of format, I read 1 audiobook, 4 print books, and then 7 ebooks, which were from the library. I actually managed to read everything from my January TBR, plus a couple of extras, except The Burning God by R.F. Kuang, which I am kind of in the middle of right now. I started it yesterday and I'm about 30% through, I think. So since I'm going back to my regular wrap-up format here, I am going to once again rank the books from the ones I enjoyed the least up through the ones I enjoyed the most. I don't like to give actual star ratings to books or anything like that if you're new to my channel. I just find it depends a lot based on my mood on the day anyway, and sometimes I end up giving books the same ranking for very different reasons, and I just overall don't really like having to assign numbers to books. So in my videos, I never give star ratings. I just kind of talk about what I liked and didn't like about the book, and I'll rank them in order. So overall, January was a pretty good reading month for me, and there were actually a couple really good books, but I feel like overall it clustered to be kind of average. I read a lot of books that I thought were just fine, so I feel like a big chunk of this video will just be books that were basically okay. But my least favorite book this month, which I honestly didn't think was okay, I really didn't care for it, was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I talked about this book in my video where I did 3 mini reviews, and I'll mention the other 2 books in that video as well as I get to them, but basically I just did not like Addie LaRue. I thought that this was kind of a boring, self-indulgent book where a character just kind of sulked around for 300 years while completely ignoring the major world events going on around her and just feeling bad about her own situation, which, I don't know, I wasn't all about it. So yeah, I know some people really connected to this book, and other people seem to have had kind of the same reaction I did. So sometimes there are books that are just either it really works for you or it really doesn't work for you, and that's fine. The next book I read was a novella. It was The Slow Regard of Silent Things, which was a submission to my Magic TBR hat from my friend Daniel. And I liked this, but it just had some problems. I did a video about this. It was one of my most recent videos. I'll link to that down below as well. And this was just actually a really hard book to talk about because Rothfuss's writing is really good, but there are just other problems with this, but also the author himself is so aware of what the book is like that it has around 300 disclaimers before you even get to the actual story. So it's hard to complain about something being the thing that it's very clearly advertising itself as. And again, I didn't hate The Slow Regard of Silent Things. In some ways, I kind of enjoyed it. It was a pretty quick novella to read. It had some lovely illustrations. It was very evocative. His writing is beautiful. It just also didn't totally work for me. I don't know. I find it hard to talk about. The next book I'm going to talk about was also a pick from the Magic Hat in January, The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. This is a debut novel. It's a 2020 release. The tagline sounded pretty interesting. It's about an orc priestess who is sentenced to die and then gets rescued by a sorcerer and ends up working for him. The really interesting thing about this book is that although the description talks about orcs and things like that, actually it's just a world that is populated by various non-human races. So the main character, Sorway, she is, I guess we would describe her as an orc, but the word orc is never used in world in this book. We know she has gray skin and she has tusks, and that's what her race is. And then there are other races that are more like elves or more like other things, but they have their own names, so they aren't like typical fantasy races. So a lot of the setup for this book was really interesting, and I thought starting it that I was going to end up loving it, but then it basically just didn't really go anywhere. The setup is really cool. It's almost science fiction-esque, where there are all these worlds that are connected by kind of a maze that are accessible by airships. And it almost had kind of like a science fiction multi-dimension feel, and the world building that you get is very interesting. But it just had a lot of promise, but then it felt kind of bland, honestly. Like, I think it was sort of not exactly a hero's journey, but I guess you could call it a coming of age of the main character. It starts out when she's 13 and she gets saved from expected sacrifice, basically. And then she ends up working for this mentor, where she has kind of a weird relationship with, and ends up meeting other people that are important to her along the way. And it's like she kind of has to make some decisions, and she has kind of her own journey. But I don't know, like, I think maybe she just didn't work for me as a character. I would totally read more by this author, but it was just one of those books that I thought I was going to love, and in the end it was just kind of bland. Like, the setup, everything was really promising, but I didn't even do a review of this because I didn't feel like there was enough there to really talk about. I didn't dislike it. It was perfectly fine, but I also didn't like it because it felt like there wasn't quite enough to like. Actually, I feel like I had kind of a similar reaction to this book as The Ruin of Kings, which I read last year, which is that the first chapter or so really hooked me, and just the setup and the concept behind it seemed super promising, and then it just kind of meandered off into nothingness. And I'm kind of curious, I know the books are put out by the same publisher, so I'm kind of curious if the same editor bought these two books or series, and if so, like, if they were looking for something specific and these books or authors fulfilled that, because I'm having kind of a similar reaction to them. And I just think that's kind of interesting. So my next favorite book was A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. This was a book I was really excited about, and I did like it, but just not enough to recommend it. I liked it just enough that I had zero regrets about having read it. I was never bored while I was reading it. It was very digestible, it was quick, it was easy to read, and I didn't really feel like it lived up to the dark academia promise that seemed really interesting about it. I overall actually liked the main character, I liked the dark humor, and there were things about it that worked for me, but it was just fine. I talked about this in my mini reviews video as well, so that link is down below if you want to hear more about my thoughts about A Deadly Education. But basically, yeah, it was perfectly fine, enjoyed it, still like Naomi Novik as an author, will still read the next one, but just not super excited about this series, not the way I hoped I would be. The next book I'll talk about I actually listened to on audiobook, and this is Whose Body by Dorothy Sayers. This is the first one in the Lord Peter Wimsey mystery series. This book was written around, well, I think it's set in like 1920. I think it was maybe published in 1923, and it really shows. This is the first book in a longer series focusing on this detective, Lord Peter Wimsey. He's basically the classic gentleman detective, where he's interested in detecting, but he doesn't do anything for a living because he's too aristocratic. He's actually a really interesting character, and I have a lot of affection for him. I've enjoyed this series in the past. This was a reread for me, but what I'm finding is that the first couple books in the series are just really not as good as the later books. Lord Peter basically seems like a caricature of the detective he becomes later on, especially in this first book. He is an interesting character in terms of he has a lot of depth, which I think gets explored more later in the series. He is relatively young and he's dealing with PTSD, or as they called it, shell shock, after serving in World War I, and he has sort of started to overcome his PTSD symptoms, but he took up detection and investigation basically as a hobby to kind of distract himself as he's healing from World War I. That's a very modern way of putting it. There's a lot less emotion, I guess, in the way they talk about things in the book, but that's basically what he's dealing with. And so in this book, there's a situation where a naked body turns up in the bath of this architect, and then somebody else has gone missing. But the body in the bath is definitely not the guy that has gone missing, but nobody knows who the body is. So along with the police detective, he is kind of trying to figure out how these two cases tie together, which it seems like they do, and come up with the answers. It's a pretty classic whodunit. And the thing that I think I'm struggling with the most in this series is it's just a weirdly affectionate portrait of the British aristocracy, which is both enjoyable, but also a little bit uncomfortable. In this book, there's also a slightly uncomfortable undercurrent that is kind of anti-Semitic, and it's really just reflecting the attitudes that characters would have had at the time. So yeah, it's a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, but it's definitely just a portrait of what English society would have been like in the 1920s. Like, the characters themselves are not really anti-Semitic. It's just that they're sometimes kind of ignorant. And actually, the only Jewish character in the book is portrayed very sympathetically. But just, be aware of that going in. Sometimes when you're reading books from the 1920s, this kind of thing comes up. It's an issue in Dickens as well. I'm definitely planning to keep reading and listening to this series. It's one that I've really enjoyed in the past, and when it really hits its stride, I think I'm really going to enjoy it. And luckily, this was a pretty short audiobook, and it was enjoyable enough to just listen to and cleaning around the house and stuff like that, which is when I usually do my listening. But just definitely not like my top tier of mysteries or even, top tier Dorothy Sayers. I think a lot of people will tell you if you're starting this series, just go straight to the good ones. Don't read chronologically from the beginning because the first few are just Next, I'll talk about Over the Woodward Wall, which is by A. Deborah Baker, a pen name of Seanan McGuire. I'll link to my review of this down below as well. This book is a companion to Middle Game. It's basically a book within a book in Middle Game that is supposed to be kind of a classic children's fantasy series, and then she actually went and wrote the book that was depicted in Middle Game, and I actually really enjoyed it. It was a really nice book. I think geared for either kids or grown-up kids at heart. It definitely appealed to my sense of the whimsical. This book is pretty short. I think I read it all on January 1st, and it was just kind of a nice way to start the year. I overall really enjoyed it, but it does completely end on kind of a cliffhanger, and I think they've announced the publication of the next one in the series, so she is planning to continue this. But I just feel like if you have actual kids in your life that you'd like to read this book to or with, I would recommend waiting until she finishes the series or something like that, because when I was a kid, if I'd read something ending like the way this book ended, I would have been really frustrated. I wouldn't have been able to handle it. Next, I'm going to talk about Hall of Smoke, which is by H.M. Long. This is a debut novel that just came out this month. I picked this book because I had picked the prompt of reading a new release from January this past month, and so I just really quickly looked through books that were coming out and picked this one. And overall, I liked it. I actually have a dedicated review, which is coming soon. This is a Viking-inspired fantasy, and I think a lot of elements in it were really strong. Didn't totally stick the ending, but I just generally enjoyed this book, and I'm looking forward to seeing what else the author does. But overall, I thought there were some strong things in this book, and overall, I thought it was an enjoyable journey. Next for me is Chaos Choreography by Seanan McGuire. This is book 5 in the InCryptid series. With this book, we're back with our original narrator, Verity Price, and I honestly thought this was going to be like my favorite book in the series so far, because in this book, Verity has to go back undercover and resume her reality TV career because the ballroom dance show that she had previously been part of with a secret identity is doing like a all-stars season, and so she gets invited to go back on. And she had previously decided she was going to quit her professional dance career and just focused on being a cryptozoologist and focus on that side, which is basically the family business. So I just thought the whole reality TV Hollywood element was going to be super entertaining, and I did really enjoy this book, but I don't think it was my favorite in the series so far. I did really love a couple of the new characters that got introduced, especially her dimension hopping firearm toting grandmother was just a really awesome character that I'm looking forward to seeing more of in the series. But yeah, I've really enjoyed all of the InCryptid series so far. This was no exception. I thought this was going to be a standout, and I think it was just a solid installment in the series. But I enjoyed getting to go back to Verity as a narrator after 2 books where her brother was the main character. All right, so my next favorite was The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. I've set a goal of reading all of The Wheel of Time this year, which is really going to be a push, but I'm looking forward to it. I did more of a reaction video than a review for this book, which I'll link to down below. But overall, I really enjoyed it. This book got me reading before bed, which is something that I hadn't done in many years because usually I just kind of pass out and go to sleep these days, but I've actually continued to read before bed since I picked up Robert Jordan. So, that's kind of magical. Overall, I liked The Eye of the World. I did not love The Eye of the World, but I'm really excited to continue the series. I'm reading this whole series because it's kind of an exchange with my best friend where she's going to read all of the Cosmere and I'm going to read all of The Wheel of Time, which she loves. I have to say, one of my favorite things so far about reading The Wheel of Time is actually the fans. I posted that reaction video, which it wasn't really even a review. It was just me talking about my experience reading the book and my memories from reading the book as a kid versus now, because I had read it before. And I got so many comments from Wheel of Time fans, and a lot of them were super encouraging and really nice. And I just really enjoyed that community, and some of you guys subscribed. So if you're watching this, thank you. I'm looking forward to continuing to doing some Wheel of Time content as I continue this journey. But I just felt like really welcomed by all of those comments telling me how much they loved the Wheel of Time and, encouraging me to keep going and all of this stuff. So that was actually really, really nice. And I also know a couple of you who watch this channel are also trying to read the Wheel of Time this year. So yeah, I'm just honestly, that community engagement just gets me even more excited about reading this series, even though it's something I'm kind of doing for and with a friend. But so yeah, thank you, all of you guys who commented. Thank you for being part of this, and I really appreciate you. I haven't read a classic in a long time, but last month I read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Bronte. And I thought about doing a review for this actually, but it's just so not what I usually talk about on my channel. So I figured I should ease you guys into the fact that I occasionally, very rarely read things that aren't fantasy. I also kind of buddy read this with my best friend, and we had kind of similar reactions, but I ended up liking it more than she did. I can't actually say that I loved this book, but it was very interesting and I'm still thinking about it. And I think it does have a really important message, so it has definitely stuck with me. I had never read anything by Bronte before, and it is pretty different than anything by the other Bronte sisters, like Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. This book is basically the story of a woman who leaves her husband and takes her son with her, and that is something that at the time when this book was written and at the time when it's set, that actually would have been illegal for her to do, because she and her child basically belonged to her husband. So this book has often been described as the first feminist novel, and I can kind of see that. She basically marries this guy hoping she can change him, and it turns out that he's alcoholic and abusive. And my best friend kind of complained about the fact that he was absolutely a caricature, kind of like the worst possible husband someone could have. And he was emotionally abusive. He basically was gaslighting her. He was doing whatever he wanted and then blaming it on her, and then telling her if she wasn't such a nag, or if she, basically didn't react to him, then he wouldn't be bad. I don't know. It was pretty horrible to read. And even though it was set in the 19th century, I feel like a lot of these things do still happen in relationships, but at least these days it is not illegal for people to leave their partners if it gets abusive. Of course, it's still really challenging, but there's just this extra level of challenge. And so I think the fact that the husband is really sort of a two-dimensional villain in this book, but also, I think he kind of had to be that bad for Bronte to make a case that it was okay for a woman to take the initiative and leave him. But anyway, the book is actually told, the first half of it is from the point of view of this sort of gentleman farmer named Gilbert, who's living in kind of a classic small town when a mysterious woman starts renting a part of the abandoned estate nearby that has been vacant for a lot of years, and it's just her and her son, and she claims to be a widow and nobody really knows who she is. So of course he falls in love with her, and then eventually he learns her story. So I really enjoyed this book and thought it was really interesting. It definitely took me a while to get into the style because I just hadn't read anything 19th century in quite a long time. But once I got into it, it was really a nice break for my brain, and I'm looking forward to continuing to sprinkle in some classics here and there as the mood strikes me. So I had really two favorite books that I read this month, and it was very, very hard to pick which book would be my top book of the month. So I'm putting this one second, but really it could have been first, and that is Arm of the Sphinx by Josiah Bancroft. This is the sequel to Senlin Ascends. I am actually planning to do a review of this, so I won't talk about it too much right now, but it definitely lives up to the promise of Senlin Ascends. It is very different in some ways, especially in that we get a lot more viewpoints, and it is sort of a less surreal, confusing book than Senlin Ascends, where you have more characters that have some knowledge, some sense of what's going on. It is a bit more focused on the journeys of all these different characters and not just on Senlin. But even though this was a little bit different than Senlin Ascends, I thought the writing was still great, characters were still great, basically still loved it overall. It just didn't quite, I would say I just didn't love it quite as much as Senlin Ascends, and I think I actually just really enjoyed that surreal trippiness of Senlin Ascends where you're not really quite sure what's going on because he is so confused. But other than that, I really loved everything about this book. I feel pretty certain now that I'll like the rest of the books in the series. I think that part of the reason I put off reading book 2 for a while is because I loved book 1 so much, and sometimes I just get scared that book 2 won't be as good and it'll be disappointing and then I'll be sad. So I was definitely not sad. I loved this book. I'm excited to do a review for it. So for this month, my favorite book that I read was A Memory Called Empire, which was a reread for me. I wanted to reread one book that I read last year, so I picked this one because the sequel is coming out, I think, in March. I've seen a few people that have had arcs already and who have said that the sequel is really good. So lucky them, I'm kind of jealous, but I'm happy I got to reread this because I was kind of finding that while I remembered the themes and the characters actually really well, I just couldn't remember the details of what happened for some reason. So this was a really good refresher. And I think I loved this book even more this time. I really liked it the first time I read it, don't get me wrong. But this is a really good example of sometimes the order or like the circumstances you read a book in can really affect how you perceive it. So I read this book right after Gideon the Ninth, which is, well, it's weird, but it's a very accessible, funny, dark book where I just really loved the characters, I loved the humor, and it's just so much a louder book than this book that I feel like while I really liked A Memory Called Empire and thought it was a great book, I just didn't connect to it in the same way as I connected to Gideon, which is fine. So I think it just suffered a little bit in comparison. But now reading it in a different context, I just had more of an emotional response to the book. It is in some ways definitely still a quieter book than Gideon the Ninth. I still think that the characters, while they are well done, they are a bit understated, and I just didn't develop an extreme emotional connection to them. Well, I thought they were, well developed and interesting. I won't talk too much about this book either because I do still have a review up for it. I think this is totally a book that deserves to be an award-winning book. I don't know, I spend so much time talking about the Hugos and about awards, and I don't even think I really believe in awards. I think it's just kind of a fun framework for me to do videos in and to sort of keep track of things in. I don't know. But yeah, I think awards are of dubious value, to be perfectly honest. But I think this is a book that deserves to win awards. It's just, I can't believe this is a debut novel. It is so well constructed. It's a little bit dense, but what I was actually struck by this time, which I think I just didn't notice as much, is the writing is actually really beautiful. And I didn't notice that so much the first time I read it. So I'm really happy I reread this book. I'm really excited for book 2. And I think just doing the reread took this book up probably onto my list of favorites, where I feel like before it was kind of hovering just below all-time favorite books. And I feel like this just kind of, I appreciate it even more now, which is great. That's the best kind of reread. So like I mentioned, the one book on my TBR that I didn't get to this month was The Burning God. I'm in the middle of it right now, so hopefully I'll finish that soon. Otherwise, my February TBR is already up if you're curious to see what I'm going to read in February. But thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you have read any of these books or if you're planning to and what your thoughts are. I always really enjoy hearing other people's takes on books. I especially enjoy hearing takes of people that had opposite opinions to me because that's half the fun of BookTube, honestly. But thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe if you want to see more videos from me.